damp dungeon that reeked of rot and wet stone, King Edward was brought in chains, and the first blow from the guard made him double over, gasping for breath. From that moment on, his final weeks began, not a quick end, but a prolonged humiliation, where every breath was a reminder of his inevitable execution. Edward II, the former monarch of England, was stripped not only of his crown, but also of his human dignity, his penis. His fate was decided not on the battlefield, but in the cramped halls of councils, where old barons argued with a new entourage about the country's legacy and future. Dynastic factions pushed forward their own candidates, French ambassadors whispered about advantageous marriages, and supporters of a strict line demanded public punishment to symbolize retribution for years of misrule. Reports preserved in the archives note, "The sovereign's body is ravaged by disease, his spirit is broken, but he still clings to power through fear and threats." The first sign of decay was his skin. At the beginning of his imprisonment, ulcers appeared on his thighs, which grew and emitted a foul odor. Doctors admitted to him, by order of the guards, recorded the color of the discharge daily. A disgusting smell, a brownish-green tint. The edges of the ulcers are covered with a crust. At first, they tried bloodletting in small doses twice a week, hoping to reduce the fever. Leeches were placed on his groin and under his knees for a quarter of an hour. At dawn, Edward was given a pinch of opium powder, and in the evening, 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup to help him sleep. His tongue became coated, and his urine became dark and foul-smelling. Everything was recorded hour by hour, as if every word carried responsibility for future generations. But the doctors were powerless. The air in the room where he was kept quickly became saturated with rot. The servants complained that changing the sheets and felt pads did not help with the stench. The king's heels were covered with cracks, and dirt and blood accumulated under his fingernails. His clothes had to be removed with straps because the sores stuck to the fabric. One of the guards wrote in his diary, "He screamed in pain when we tore the pus-soaked cloth from his body. The smell was so bad that even the rats wouldn't come near him." Restrictions on access were tightened. Guards from different families were posted at the doors, replacing each other, each keeping the keys with them. The list of those allowed in changed every week, and each ruling faction tried to get its own priest or advisor in. The French ambassador complained in a letter, "I cannot see the sovereign, for the guards say that the keys are with the commander of another party." This created chaos and multiplied rumors that the king's body was rotting so quickly that they were hiding it, that he was dictating new wills in his delirium, each contradicting the other. Edward still tried to hold on to the remnants of his power. He demanded that papers be rewritten and sealed, even though his hand was shaking and the ink was smudging. Sometimes he suspected that the inkwell was poisoned and forced his servant to drink from it. His paranoia grew. He suspected treachery, even in his food. Before each meal, the guards forced the junior servants to taste the dishes, and the records of the tasting were copied into 2 lists, one for the commander of the guard and the other for the chancellor. Wine had to be poured from jugs sealed with wax seals, but the seals were often replaced. At night, meetings were held. First one group of barons, then another would gather at the doors of the dungeon and argue about who had the right to enter first. The religious situation became even more grim. The king was confessed every day, first by a Franciscan, then by a Dominican, then by a local parish priest sent on someone's recommendation. Edward spoke little, but increasingly asked the same question, "Can God forgive me for what I have done?" The answers varied. Some promised mercy, others threatened hell. Each priest then left and passed on the sovereign's words to his party, who used them in their intrigues. Physical decay progressed. Purulent fistulas appeared on his stomach, through which fluid oozed. Doctors tried to cauterize the wounds with red-hot iron, but the tissue spread even further. Ointments made from lard and herbs were applied 3 times a day, but they only intensified the stench. Compresses were applied for an hour and changed every half hour, but the fabric immediately became wet and sticky. The king moaned and cursed everyone around him. His fear of execution grew. He knew that the barons were arguing not only about his heir, but also about the manner of his death. Some demanded simple strangulation or the sword, while others insisted on a humiliating punishment. Servants whispered that the word penis was mentioned in their conversations, and this drove Edward into a frenzy. He grabbed himself and screamed that no one had the right to deprive him of his mark of manhood. These panic attacks frightened even the guards. He could suddenly rush forward, despite the straps, and then 4 men had to hold him back. The Chancellor's report states, "His body is decaying, but his mind is not yet dead. He demands execution, but in his own way. He asks for a sword, not a knife." However, voices are increasingly being heard in the council that the disgrace must be complete. These words later formed the basis of versions of the story about the deliberate execution by cutting off a limb. This continued for weeks. The guards changed. Servants died from infections after touching his body. Doctors argued among themselves, and the smell of decay grew in his chambers. And each new day brought him closer to the humiliation he feared more than death itself. Edward's body was decomposing rapidly, and the smell in his chambers became unbearable. The guards complained that even through the thick felt partitions, the air was saturated with the stench of rot and urine. Traces of pus appeared on the bed to which he was tied with straps, and every change of linen became torture. When the sticky fabric was torn from his sores, the king screamed, and his cries echoed hollowly from the stone vaults. A guard's report noted, "His penis is swollen and covered with sores, and every time we touch him to wash him, he screams that his flesh is being cut." The doctors, who were replaced on the orders of various parties, recorded everything in their notes. One wrote, "The sores on his thighs and groin ooze a foul-smelling brown liquid. His penis is covered with cracks and abscesses around the flesh. He screams when he urinates because the urine eats away at the wounds." Another doctor noted in a treatise, "The pulse is weak, the tongue is black, the urine is thick, but the penis is swollen, cracked, and purple." These records were preserved in the archives and became proof that his physical humiliation began long before his execution. The procedures continued, although they became increasingly cruel. Bloodletting was performed in small portions 3 times a week, but his strength was leaving him faster than the pain. Leeches were placed on his groin near his penis for a quarter of an hour, and his skin was covered with bruises afterwards. Cauterization was performed on specific points on the thighs and near the scrotum in the hope of stopping the spread of gangrene, but the tissue swelled and the wounds grew larger. Ointments made of lard, garlic, and mercury compounds were rubbed twice a day into the groin area, including the penis itself, causing him to scream, kick, and beg for it to stop. At night, he was given 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup, but his sleep became restless. He often woke up, grabbed his penis with his hands, checked to see if it was still there, and moaned that he would soon be deprived of his last possession. Servants whispered that the Baron's council was already discussing the most humiliating form of execution. Some spoke of burning, others of swords, but more and more often the minutes mentioned, "The execution will begin with the cutting off of the penis." This news reached Edward. He cried and screamed that he was still king, and that no one had the right to touch his penis. His words were recorded by the priest. "I confessed him, and he spoke only of his fear of losing his penis. He did not repent of his murders and treason. He thought only of that." The servants noticed strange symptoms while washing him. His penis often bled spontaneously, the skin cracked, and blood soaked into the sheets. Sometimes he would scratch it with his fingernails until it bled, and then his hands would be tied with straps. Fistulas formed on his thighs, from which pus flowed, and some of the fluid got on his penis, causing new ulcers. A servant wrote, We tried to wash him with herbal decoctions every half hour, but the wounds would not close. The smell was so bad that even the guards covered their noses with cloth. The political struggle intensified. The old barons who demanded his death argued with the young entourage, who hoped to use him as a living symbol and puppet. The French ambassadors stalled for time, promising support to the heir, but demanding that the execution be shameful so that England would remember it. The Spanish ambassador, on the contrary, wrote in his report, "Death by the sword would be quick," but here they want to deprive him of his penis to show that power has lost its strength forever. These words spread throughout the court and made Edward's fear even stronger. Every day he demanded confession, but when the priest asked him about his sins, he returned to the same question. "Tell me, if they cut off my penis, will they let me into heaven?" Some priests answered in the affirmative. Others evaded the question, but this did not reassure him. His cries could be heard even in the corridors, and the guards exchanged mocking remarks. Food was strictly inspected. Every piece of bread and every dish was tasted by a servant, and the results were recorded twice. Once, the wine had a strange smell, and Edward cried out that they wanted to deprive him not only of his life, but also of his penis before he died. He suspected that the poison was affecting his flesh. The Chancellor's report noted, "He refuses to eat unless they check whether the food is causing illness in his penis." At night, his condition worsened. He was delirious, grabbing his penis and screaming that he was being cut. Servants tried to restrain him, but the straps on the bed broke. Traces of blood remained on the sheets. The doctor wrote, "At night, he screamed continuously for 3 hours, shouting only one word, 'penis.' His voice was hoarse, but he continued to repeat it until he fell asleep from exhaustion." Meanwhile, the intrigue reached its peak. Some parties forged wills, others slipped him paper to sign, claiming that they were only prayers. But he still signed with a trembling hand, sometimes dripping ink onto the document. Each new document contradicted the previous one, and his advisors argued about which will was genuine. But everyone knew that the final decision depended on how and when he would be executed. In his final weeks, his body was almost completely covered in sores. His penis had swollen to an ugly size, the skin was bursting, and the servants could barely touch him. They applied compresses every hour, but it did not help. The smell from his chambers was so strong that the guards were changed more often than usual. People could not stand to be near him for more than 4 hours. And all this time, Edward clung to one thing. He was afraid only of having his penis cut off. Even death frightened him less than this prospect. And the reports of his advisors said, "He is already dead in spirit, but still clinging to his flesh. He has lost his power, but his fear remains. He fears only that he will lose his manhood, and that will be the symbol of his end." In his final weeks, Edward's condition became terminal. He hardly got out of bed, his body was held up by straps, and his chambers turned into a festering den. Every step of his servants was accompanied by a sloshing sound. Fluid from his sores collected on the stone slabs under his bed. His thighs had turned into a mess. His skin was falling off in layers, and the doctors wrote, "Pus is flowing non-stop, brownish yellow in color, with a putrid odor. The penis remains swollen, cracked, and oozing blood and mucus. Urine is mixed with pus." His vision began to deteriorate. He complained that he saw everything in red and black spots. Doctors suspected blood poisoning. His tongue swelled, and his speech became slurred. But even in his delirium, he repeated the same words, "My penis, don't let them take it." Servants noted that at night he could moan for 6 hours straight, uttering only those words. Sometimes he would grab himself, and his hands would be covered in blood. The guards tied his hands with leather straps, but even through them, he tried to squeeze his groin. The procedures became a routine of torture. The compresses were changed every 20 minutes, but the fabric was immediately soaked with fluid. Leeches were no longer used. The skin could not withstand them. It tore, and the leeches slipped off. Cauterization was discontinued. The tissue did not heal. All that remained were ointments and washings. Servants rubbed his groin with a mixture of lard and vinegar, but this only intensified his cries. One servant wrote, "When we smeared his penis, he screamed that we were castrating him. He spat at us and called us executioners." The advisors argued fiercely. Some said, "It's time to finish him off with a sword, so as not to prolong the agony." Others replied, "The people must see the shame. Let the execution begin with the cutting off of his penis, so that it will be a lesson to all." The French ambassador wrote in his report, "He is already dead, but they are still arguing about how exactly to cut off his penis. The execution has become a symbol of political struggle." Religious disputes became increasingly grim. Some priests argued that the loss of the penis did not prevent the salvation of the soul, while others claimed that it was a sign of defilement that closed the gates of paradise. These words reached Edward, and he cried out in despair. "I will not enter paradise without a penis," wrote one monk. His confession no longer concerned murders, betrayals, or wars. He spoke only of his penis. The servants who were supposed to wash him began to die from infection. One's hand began to rot after touching his wounds. Another died 3 days later from fever. New servants were recruited from among the prisoners, promising them freedom, but they too quickly fell ill. The Chronicles note, 5 died after touching him. 1 lost his hand, and all this from the rot coming from his penis. The guards could not stand the smell. The guards were changed every 2 hours, although previously it was every 8 hours. People wrote complaints that the air from the chambers was infecting the entire corridor. In response, they began to place censers with incense, but they did not help. The priest noted, "The smell of decay comes primarily from his groin, from his penis, and no prayers can drown out the stench." Edward began to lose consciousness. He fell into delirium, sometimes for days at a time, and then the doctors thought he was dead. But then he would open his eyes and come back to himself. Even as he was dying, he checked to see if his penis was still there. In the Chancellor's report, he no longer speaks of power or the crown. He speaks only of his penis, and this is a disgrace to the entire dynasty. Meanwhile, the intrigue reached its climax. Some demanded immediate execution. Others waited for him to die on his own, so as not to take the sin upon themselves. But death was delayed. The body continued to rot, but the heart kept beating, and the fear that he would lose his penis while still alive tormented him until the very end. When it became clear that Edward's body would not last another month, preparations began for the final act. Doctors, servants, and priests recorded his condition every day, but it all boiled down to one thing. The penis is decomposed, the tumor is not subsiding, the ulcers are festering. The doctors wrote that it was no longer possible to draw blood. The veins were clogged with pus, and the needles broke in the dead tissue. His pulse was barely detectable, his breathing became wheezing, and his urine dripped in worm-like threads. The servants no longer washed him completely. They only wiped the perineum where his penis lay with rags, and held it in place with their hands so that he would not tear it off. He was still delirious, screaming, "Don't let them! Don't give them my penis!" Even in an unconscious state, his fingers clenched convulsively in his groin. It was decided to carry out the execution in the castle, not to take him outside. The servants wrote, "His body will not survive the journey," but in order to preserve a lesson for others, it was decided to begin the mutilation with the penis, as had been decreed. By this time, his genitals were already deformed. His scrotum had turned black. His penis was swollen with blisters, and the skin was peeling off in layers. The doctor's report described it as follows. "The penis is covered in ulcers, there is a worm on the head, and it smells like a corpse." A few days before his execution, they tried to force him to sign his last will and testament. The paper was brought at night under the guise of confession. His hand was shaking. He could not hold the pen. and ink dripped onto the bed. He shouted, "Let the throne go to my son, but do not give my penis to my enemies." His advisors looked on in horror. The king was dying, and all his words were about this. As a result, the document was signed for him by another person, who affixed the seal. On the night before the execution, security was tightened. The guards were replaced by representatives of 3 families, so that no one could later say that the execution had been carried out in secret. Access to the chambers was restricted. Only the chief guard and the chancellor had the keys. Rumors circulated that there was a secret passage, and attempts were made to smuggle a priest in, but he was not allowed in. Everything had to be done officially. In the morning, he was carried out on a stretcher. He was still alive, although his body was unresponsive. His eyes were half open, his lips moved, and individual words could be heard. Penis, penis. He was secured to a wooden bench, his hands and feet tied with straps. Felt was laid under him so that the blood would not drip onto the stones. The executioner acted on orders. Doctors stood nearby, monitoring his breathing and pulse. The crowd was not allowed inside, but several representatives of the nobility and ambassadors were present. One of them wrote, "When the executioner took out his knife, the king suddenly came to life and screamed so loudly that the castle walls shook. All his words boiled down to one thing. He was screaming about his penis. With the first blow, the executioner cut off his penis. Black, viscous blood gushed out, smelling of rot." The doctors recorded, after the penis was cut off, his breathing became intermittent, but his heart was still beating. He was tortured for another 2 hours before he was finished off. All this time he was gasping, twitching, trying to twist away, but the straps held him down. The servants noted, even as he was dying, he reached for his groin, but his penis was already gone. When he finally fell silent, a silence hung in the hall. The executioner picked up the severed penis and showed it to the advisors. This was confirmation that the execution had been carried out completely. One of the clerks noted, "Never before have we seen such a great ruler end his life in such a lowly manner, by having his penis cut off." The body remained on the bench until evening, while they decided how to embalm it. But the smell was unbearable, the servants wrote. The cut body exuded a stench, and worms swarmed in the groin. During embalming, the penis was not found. It had been taken away by the executioner. After Edward's body was carried out of the execution chamber, the air in the castle was filled with an unbearable stench. The servant's report states, "The king's body gave off a foul odor. A gaping wound was visible in his groin, and his penis was missing. The attempt at embalming failed. The tissue disintegrated in their hands. The blood curdled into dark clots, and the scrotum was completely decomposed. The embalmers wrote that it was impossible to treat the odor. The smell of decay was coming from there. Therefore, the upper part of the body was rubbed with resins and herbs, and the lower part was covered with thick cloth to hide the absence of the penis." At that time, a fierce struggle was raging in the council chamber. The old nobility demanded that a new king be proclaimed immediately, arguing that Edward's death had been proven publicly. The new entourage, on the contrary, was playing for time. They rewrote the will, inserting names that were advantageous to them. Later, one of the chancellors wrote in a letter, "We held 2 different wills in our hands, one in which he appointed his son, and another in which new advisors were named. But his hand was shaking, the ink was running, he was screaming about his penis, and none of the documents could be considered authentic. Foreign ambassadors hastily sent reports to their countries. One French report contains the following lines: "The King of England is dead, and his death was shameful. The cutting off of his penis made it more terrible than any war. The people will now remember only this." The Spanish ambassador replied, "If power is based on fear, then his death has destroyed that fear. Now, turmoil will begin." Rumors spread instantly in London. People whispered in the markets. The king's penis was cut off, and that is why he died like a sinner. Others claimed that the penis had been secretly taken away to be used in witchcraft. The church tried to suppress such talk, but the priests themselves did not know how to explain the execution. One of the monastery chroniclers noted, "I saw with my own eyes how the body was carried out without a penis. For the people, this is a sign of divine punishment." Edward's son was declared heir, but his power proved unstable. The old lords demanded the continuation of the executions of his father's supporters. The new advisors insisted on mercy and peace with their neighbors. Because of this, the kingdom split. Some of the barons supported the son, while others joined a conspiracy, claiming that death by castration had cursed the throne. The army demanded payment, but the treasury was empty. Mercenaries spread out across the villages, and the people began to fear not only the authorities, but also looting. The locals said, when the king's penis was taken away, the power of the whole land was taken away. This phrase even entered later chronicles as a sign of the fall of the dynasty. The king's body was buried secretly at night. Because of the stench and decay, the coffin was lined with lead. Only a few loyal servants and 2 priests were present. The testimony states, "We laid him in the coffin and covered his groin with rags. The penis was missing. Someone said that it was not the king's body, but a substitute, but the smell and the sores left no doubt." After the burial, the news of the severed penis became a weapon in the political struggle. Some said that it was a sign of God's punishment for sins, others that it was the cruelty of the new nobility. The Chronicles record, rumors of a penis cut off during his lifetime destroyed respect for the throne. The people ceased to fear the crown. Edward's death was not the end, but the beginning of turmoil. His son's power was undermined by intrigues. Ambassadors wrote of impending chaos, and monasteries rewrote their chronicles with the same conclusion. Such a shameful end will never be forgotten. The king's penis became a symbol of the fall of an entire state.